They said it was just for a little while, Grandma. But don't. His small hand clutched mine with a strange firmness, a gravity far beyond his 9 years. And I remember thinking, absurdly, that he looked older in that moment than his father had ever seemed. I can still feel the trembling of his fingers when they loosened from mine. I can still hear the dry sound of the front door closing behind me, the echo of finality in that click. They told me it was for rest, that I had earned peace, that I should not worry about the details. I wanted to believe them. I always wanted to believe those I loved, even when their voices had already begun to sound like strangers through the thick glass of politeness and pity. I am 81 now, living in a small apartment by the sea, where gulls argue over crusts of bread, and the salt wind dries the laundry faster than I can hang it. The neighbors think I am simply another widow with too many memories and too little family. They do not know that I once had a home with 5 bedrooms, that I once paid for my son's college, that my name was on every paper and every account until one winter morning it was not. I used to think I had lived an honest life. That kindness could be armor enough. But I was wrong. Kindness, when offered without vigilance, can become a currency others spend in your name. When Mark, my only son, suggested I move in with him after my hip surgery, I felt almost grateful. He and his wife, Julia, had a big house in the suburbs, and they said they wanted me close. "You shouldn't be alone at your age, Mom," he said, brushing crumbs from the kitchen table as if wiping away the years between us. I believed him, or at least pretended to. For a while, it felt almost like belonging again. I would make breakfast for Leo before school, mend small things, water the plants. I liked hearing the sounds of the house, the shower running upstairs, the car leaving the driveway, the distant hum of the television at night. Those noises were proof of life, and I clung to them, but slowly, quietly, I began to notice how every kindness was also a removal. Julia would say, "Oh, don't tire yourself. Let me handle the bills." Or, "You don't need to worry about the phone plan anymore. We've added you to ours." At first it sounded like care. Only later did I understand it was consolidation. It was Leo who sensed something before I did. Children see, through the softness adults build around deceit. He would look at his father sometimes with a frown too deep for his round face, and once, after hearing them whisper in the study, he came to me with eyes wide and frightened. "They're talking about moving you somewhere, Grandma. Somewhere with nurses." I laughed then, told him not to worry, that it was only about the recovery place the doctor had mentioned. But he shook his head with such certainty that the laughter died in my throat. "Don't trust them," he whispered. I should have listened then. Instead, I smoothed his hair and told him grown-ups sometimes just needed to talk. I wanted to believe that family could not turn into something predatory. I wanted to believe that love was still the same language we had always spoken. It wasn't. The day they drove me to the rest home, I remember the smell of Julia's perfume filling the car, something floral and synthetic that made the air feel heavy. Mark kept saying, "It's only temporary, Mom, just until the doctor clears you." I nodded, clutching my purse with both hands, my knuckles pale. When we arrived, the woman at the desk greeted me by name before I spoke. She had a file already open. That detail unsettled me more than anything. They had prepared for my arrival. I was expected, logged, documented. When I tried to ask a question, Julia touched my arm lightly, almost tenderly, and said, "We'll handle everything. You just rest." The next time I reached for my purse, it was gone. They said they had moved it for safekeeping. I told myself not to make a fuss. I had been raised to be agreeable, to trust the structure of things, to believe that families, like bones, may fracture but never truly break. At night I lay in the narrow bed and stared at the faint line of light under the door. The air smelled of bleach and overcooked vegetables. Somewhere down the hall, a woman cried softly until morning. I thought of Leo's warning then, how his voice had trembled with urgency, and for the first time I allowed myself to imagine that he might have been right. I felt shame for even thinking it. Shame, because to suspect one's own child of betrayal felt like sacrilege. But the thought would not leave. It grew, slow and quiet, like mold in the corners of a house you no longer own. The letters from Mark came weekly at first, printed on glossy paper with photographs of Leo smiling at school events. Each began with, "We miss you so much, Mom," and ended with promises that never materialized. I noticed he never mentioned when I might come home. Julia's name appeared under his, in neat loops, like the signature of a secretary on behalf of an executive. My room began to fill with small gifts, a lavender blanket, slippers, a framed photo, tokens of affection that looked, to anyone else, like love. But love, I've learned, is not what is given. It is what is risked. And they risked nothing. I began to count the weeks by the flowers that arrived every other Sunday. Always carnations, cheap, long-lasting, faintly funereal. I would watch them fade in their vase, their petals curling like secrets, and feel the quiet hollowing inside me. It wasn't anger yet, only a slow erosion of trust, like water wearing down stone. The staff called me sweetheart in the way people address children or pets, not women with histories. My name, Evelyn, was a sound they rarely used. I had become an affectionate object, not a person. One afternoon, while helping a volunteer sort donated books, I came across a novel I had once owned, my initials still penciled inside the cover. I don't know how it got there, but seeing my handwriting was like finding a fingerprint from a vanished body. I ran my finger over the faded graphite, tracing proof of my existence. I realized then how little of me remained in the world beyond those walls. Everything else, documents, accounts, decisions, was now someone else's responsibility. My sons, my daughter-in-laws, the people my grandson had warned me not to trust. Sometimes at night, I would close my eyes and replay the sound of Leo's voice, that urgent whisper. It would come to me between dreams, as if carried by the wind that rattled the thin windows. Don't trust them. Not an accusation, not even fear, just the clear voice of truth from someone still uncorrupted by the polite cruelty of adults. It is strange, isn't it, how the smallest sentence can open a fault line through the rest of your life. Those 3 words were the hinge on which everything turned. Even now, years later, when I stand on my balcony and watch the sea grinding endlessly against the shore, I think of that moment, of his hand slipping from mine, of the door closing, and of the silence that followed, so gentle and complete that I mistook it for peace, when it was really the sound of being erased. The turning point came quietly, as most betrayals do, not with the clarity of a blow, but with the slow, disorienting slide of trust dissolving into confusion. It began with a form I didn't understand. The nurse, a young woman with bright nails and a professional smile, brought it to me after breakfast one morning. "Your son just needs you to sign this, Mrs. Hale," she said, tapping the line where my name should go. "It's about your medication plan." Her tone was light, but her eyes darted away before I could ask anything. I read the heading, Financial Authorization and Medical Consent. The words blurred together, heavy with legal phrasing. When I asked if I could call my son to confirm, she hesitated, then said he had already approved it. I should have refused then. I should have trusted the discomfort tightening in my chest, that same invisible hand that had guided my grandson's warning. But I didn't want to seem difficult. Difficult people lose privileges in places like that. I smiled, took the pen, and signed what would later be called the beginning of the transfer. After that, small changes followed. The letters stopped. The flowers stopped. Even the calls became rare. And when they came, Mark's voice sounded distant, distorted by polite concern. "Mom, I've been meaning to visit, but Julia's been so busy with Leo's school, and I've been dealing with the lawyers about the property taxes. Everything's fine, don't you worry." He always said that, "Don't you worry," like a command. I used to love his voice, that deep, careful tone he had even as a boy. Now it made my stomach twist, as if the words themselves carried some anesthetic meant to dull the truth. I would hang up and stare at the beige wall, at the framed watercolor of flowers that meant nothing to me. And I would think of my old garden, the smell of real earth, the tremor of bees. The facility had no garden, only a small courtyard with stones arranged in a circle, an imitation of serenity. Sometimes I wondered if my son had ever truly known me at all, or if he only remembered the silhouette of who I was when I was useful. One afternoon, as I was being wheeled to a routine checkup, I overheard two nurses whispering near the reception desk. My name floated between them, followed by a phrase that chilled me. "Her son's taking care of the accounts now, right?" The other nodded, lowering her voice. "Power of attorney, yes. He handled all that weeks ago." I felt something drop inside me, a small, irreversible weight. I wanted to ask what they meant, but fear clamped around my throat. I waited until night, when the halls were empty, and the television murmured low from the common room, and I asked the night nurse if she could check my records. She smiled, a bit startled, and told me that kind of information wasn't accessible to residents. Residents. That word stung. Not patients, not guests. Residents, as though we were fixed to that place like furniture. The next day I called Mark. When he finally answered, his voice was sharper, rushed. "Mom, you really shouldn't worry about paperwork. Everything's under control." I asked him what kind of authorization he had signed. There was a pause, then the sound of his sigh. "It's just to make sure things are easier for you. You don't have to think about bills or taxes or the house. Julia and I are managing it. It's better this way." Better for whom? I wanted to ask, but I bit my tongue. My chest ached with the familiar pressure of wanting to believe him. I thought of all the times he had fallen, and I had picked him up, of the nights I'd stayed awake, sewing his torn shirts for school, of the warmth of his forehead against my lips when he was sick. Surely that kind of love left some trace, some protection against this quiet dispossession. But love, I was learning, does not always survive the translation into adulthood. It can wither in the language of convenience. Weeks passed. One morning, a social worker visited me in my room. She was kind, too kind, her voice practiced in its gentleness. She asked if I was comfortable, if I understood the care plan. When I hesitated, she pulled out a folder and began explaining in careful terms how my son had arranged everything, my finances, my insurance, even my resident status. "You're very fortunate," she said, smiling. "Many families don't take such thorough responsibility." I nodded mechanically, the words thudding in my skull. Fortunate. Yes, I was fortunate to have been neatly folded into administrative order, fortunate to have my independence filed away like an expired license. I asked her if I could still visit my house, even just to collect a few things. She looked momentarily uncomfortable, then said, "That would depend on your son's approval." The phrase hit like a slap. My life now depended on his approval. That night, I couldn't sleep. The facility was silent except for the slow beeping of the alarm near the nurse's station. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling tiles, counting the tiny perforations in their surface. I thought of my husband, gone now 20 years, and wondered what he would have said if he saw this. He had trusted Mark, too, believed that the boy would grow into a man of integrity. I wanted to scream, to tear the walls apart, to demand back the simple right to choose. But the body grows cautious with age. Rage becomes inward, heavy, disguised as patience. So I waited. I began to notice everything. The way the staff avoided certain questions, how my room key card sometimes failed to work until they reset it at the desk, how the mail always came opened and stapled shut again. I had been moved from care into containment, and no one had even told me. The betrayal did not come in one moment. It was a collection of small permissions I gave without realizing their cost. The signature on that first paper, the silence when he told me not to worry, the gratitude I felt for the smallest attention. I had built the very prison I was living in, brick by brick, with my own politeness. It's strange how control wears the mask of love until you are too tired to tell the difference. I began to wonder if they had planned it all along, the move, the recovery, the financial transfers, or if it had begun as convenience and grown into something darker once they realized how easy it was to manage me. Maybe betrayal, like mold, doesn't start maliciously. It just needs stillness, the kind of quiet that follows trust. Then one evening, a letter arrived, one of the few that still came. It was from the bank, addressed to me, but redirected to the facility. The envelope had been slit open already, yet inside was something they had missed. A small slip showing a withdrawal I hadn't made, an account I didn't recognize. My signature appeared at the bottom, the same rounded E and looping Y I had used all my life, but the handwriting wasn't mine. I stared at it for a long time, the way one stares at a reflection that almost looks like oneself, but not quite. That was the moment I knew. The line had been crossed. Whatever excuses I had made for them fell away. My son had become someone I did not know, and I, in his eyes, had become nothing more than an asset to be managed. When I called the bank the next day, the woman on the line was polite but firm. She said she couldn't discuss the account without authorization from my legal representative, my son. I laughed, an awful sound that startled even me. Legal representative. The irony was almost comic. The woman asked if I was all right, but I hung up. I sat in silence for a long time, the phone heavy in my hand, the air tasting of disinfectant and despair. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the confusion and the humiliation, a small ember of clarity began to glow. This was the catalyst, the invisible spark that would, in time, burn through everything false. Leo had tried to warn me, and now I woke, ate, sat by the window, and waited for something I could no longer name. At first, but beneath that dull rhythm, there was a quiet tightening, a sense that every small privilege I had, every choice, every freedom, was slowly being taken apart and catalogued elsewhere. It happened so discreetly that even now I cannot pinpoint the moment I stopped being a guest and became a ward. It might have been the morning I was told that personal calls were now to be scheduled through reception, or the week when the volunteer who used to bring me books stopped coming without explanation. The changes were always explained with kindness, policies, updates, precautions. Kindness was their camouflage. One day, I tried to call Leo from the communal phone. The line connected, and I heard his small, bright, "Hello?" before a staff member appeared beside me and said that long-distance calls were no longer included under my care plan. I smiled weakly and hung up, apologizing as if I had done something wrong. That was how they trained us, not through cruelty, but through gentle correction. Every act of independence became a breach of etiquette. Every attempt to reach beyond their control was reframed as confusion, as evidence that we were too fragile to manage our own lives. The subtlety of it was the most terrifying part. No one raised their voice. No one threatened me. They simply surrounded me with efficiency, with order, with procedures that left no room for rebellion. I began to understand that control can be exercised with a smile just as effectively as with a chain. The administrator, a man named Gregory, with the practiced warmth of a salesman, would sometimes stop by my room to check in. He would ask if I was comfortable, if I needed anything, and always concluded with the same reassuring line: "Your son really wants what's best for you, Mrs. Hale. He's such a devoted man." I used to nod, too exhausted to contradict him, but each time he said it, I felt the words press deeper into my chest like stones. There was something obscene about hearing my son praised for his devotion while I was trapped under the weight of his decisions. I tried once to mention the forged signature to Gregory, but he brushed it aside with professional smoothness. "I'm sure it's a misunderstanding," he said. "Sometimes we sign things without remembering. Happens all the time." I wanted to tell him that my memory was sharp, that I could recall the color of the curtains in my first apartment, the exact scent of my husband's shaving cream, the way my son's fingers had curled around mine when he was a baby. I hadn't forgotten a thing, but when I opened my mouth, no words came. It was easier to let him think I was confused. The quiet humiliation of that conversation lingered for days. I started noticing how the nurses spoke to me, how they exaggerated their smiles, how they repeated information as if I were deaf or dull. I began to feel myself slipping into the role they expected. There is a strange safety in invisibility. When people stop seeing you as a threat, you can move among them unnoticed. I used that to listen. I listened in the corridors, in the dining hall, in the faint echoes of the staff room, where laughter often hid cruelty. I heard my name sometimes, attached to phrases like asset transfer and liaison with family. I didn't understand all of it, but I understood enough. Somewhere beyond those walls, decisions about my life were still being made, and I had been effectively erased from the conversation. One afternoon, a young nurse I had never seen before brought me my medication. She was nervous, almost apologetic, and when I thanked her, she looked me in the eye, a rare thing there, and said softly, "You're very calm, Mrs. Hale." I asked her what she meant. She hesitated, then shrugged. Most residents get upset when they realize what's happening. "You seem resigned." The word pierced me, resigned. I had not thought of myself that way, but she was right. I had learned to swallow anger like medicine, bitter and necessary. That night, I sat by the window long after lights out, watching the parking lot beyond the gate. Cars came and went, their headlights sweeping across the wet asphalt, and for a brief moment, I imagined I saw Leo's small silhouette standing beside one of them, waiting. The vision broke something open in me. I began to cry, not the clean, cinematic tears of grief, but the slow, heaving sobs of someone who has finally accepted the truth of her captivity. After that, the world inside the facility grew sharper, more defined. I began to keep mental notes, the times the doors were locked, the names on the badges, the moments when the staff looked uneasy. I learned that information was power, even if I couldn't yet use it. There was a file cabinet near the nurses' station, often left slightly ajar at night. I would glance at it when passing, tempted to pull it open to see what they had written about me. But fear held me back. Fear and the knowledge that once you see something, you cannot unsee it. Instead, I found subtler ways to reclaim myself. I started writing small notes on scraps of paper, memories, thoughts, names, and hiding them inside books, behind picture frames, in the lining of my coat. I told myself it was to keep my mind sharp, but really it was an act of defiance. They could manage my money, my body, even my mail, but not my words. The staff began to notice changes in me. I smiled less, spoke less. When they asked how I was feeling, I said, "Fine," in a voice that gave nothing away. The silence unnerved them. People who rely on control prefer compliance dressed as gratitude. True stillness frightens them. Once, Gregory commented that I seemed withdrawn and suggested adjusting my medication. I refused, claiming side effects, though there were none. It was the first time I said no in months. He didn't press the issue, but I saw the flicker of annoyance behind his practiced expression. That small moment, that single word of refusal, became a private victory. I replayed it in my mind for days. No. The word felt foreign on my tongue, yet strangely delicious. Outside, the seasons shifted. The air grew colder, the evenings longer. Through the narrow window, I could see the tops of trees turning from green to rust, their leaves spinning down like lost years. Time inside the facility didn't follow the same rhythm. Days stretched endlessly, yet months disappeared. The calendar on the wall was always 2 weeks behind. One morning I realized it had been nearly 6 months since I had left my son's house. Half a year vanished into antiseptic silence. I had not stepped outside the gate once. I thought of the house, my house, wondering if the curtains were still the same, if Julia had changed the furniture, if Leo still snuck cookies from the tin I used to keep above the fridge. I wondered if he thought of me at all. The ache of missing him was constant, but beneath it was something new. Suspicion. What if they had turned him against me? What if, when he whispered, "Don't trust them," he had included himself? The thought horrified me, but once it appeared, it would not leave. The slow suffocation of those months taught me something crucial, that invisibility is not always imposed. Sometimes it is invited. To survive, I had allowed them to erase me. Every time I nodded instead of questioned, every time I thanked instead of protested, I had deepened my own disappearance. It is a terrible revelation to realize you have been a collaborator in your own undoing. Yet that realization, painful as it was, carried within it a sliver of strength. If I had participated in my erasure, perhaps I could also participate in my return. The thought frightened me, but it also woke me. One evening, as the facility prepared for lights out, I heard the administrator arguing on the phone in his office. His door was slightly open, and I caught fragments: audit, account discrepancy, client signature. The words hit me like sparks in dry grass. Something was shifting beyond those walls, something to do with the forged documents I had seen. I felt a surge of alertness I hadn't felt in months. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake, heart pounding, staring into the dark, feeling the old intelligence in me stir. The woman who once handled mortgages, taxes, family crises, everything. She was still there, buried but alive. The quiet erasure that had defined those months had failed to finish its work. It had made me smaller, but it had not unmade me. I realized that survival, even silent survival, is a kind of rebellion. The next morning, when the nurse came to take my vitals, I met her gaze fully for the first time. She looked startled, as though seeing me anew. That was when I knew the tide had begun to turn, though no one, not even I, could yet see the shore. It began, as all awakenings do, with something small, almost insignificant. A volunteer brought me a box of used paperbacks from the local library, romances, detective stories, books no one had wanted for years. I was sorting through them half-heartedly when a folded receipt slipped out from between the yellowed pages of one. I almost threw it away until I saw my own name printed at the top. It was a bank receipt, dated 3 months earlier, from my old joint account, showing a transfer to an investment fund I had never heard of. The signature beneath was meant to be mine, though even a stranger could have seen it wasn't. The sight of those awkward, trembling letters, an imitation of my hand, sent a current of cold recognition through me. It was as if the paper itself had whispered confirmation of what I already knew, but had been too afraid to face. I sat very still, the receipt trembling in my fingers, while the fluorescent light buzzed overhead. The room around me seemed to tilt slightly, as if the floor had shifted. I folded the paper carefully and slipped it inside the lining of my sweater. That small, crumpled document became, in my mind, a weapon. That night I couldn't eat. I pushed my dinner tray away and waited for the hallway to empty. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and something sweet, like overripe fruit. I could hear the televisions murmuring from other rooms, the hollow laughter of sitcoms that played for people who no longer remembered the jokes. My mind, however, was sharp, clearer than it had been in months. I realized that if they had gone so far as to falsify my signature, then every comforting word, every gentle explanation had been nothing but a veil. I thought of Mark's voice, the measured patience of it, the way he had spoken to me as if I were a nervous child. I understood then that his kindness had not been love, but strategy. Betrayal does not always come with anger. Sometimes it wears the face of duty. I decided to act. It was not courage that moved me, at least not in the way people imagine it, but a kind of weary precision, the instinct of a woman who has managed a household, balanced accounts, navigated decades of unspoken rules. I still remembered the name of my husband's lawyer, Mr. Patterson, though I hadn't spoken to him in nearly 15 years. I wrote him a letter that same night on a scrap of stationery I had taken from the nurse's desk weeks earlier. My handwriting was shaky, and my fingers ached, but I wrote slowly, carefully, describing everything, the facility, the transfers, the missing mail, the forged signature. I didn't dare mention Mark by name at first. It felt like blasphemy, writing that word in ink, as if the accusation itself might summon disaster. But at the end, I added a single sentence. If you receive this, please look into my affairs before it is too late. I folded the paper into thirds and sealed it inside an envelope addressed simply to his office. The next morning, I waited for the volunteer who collected outgoing mail. Her name was Nora, a quiet woman with tired eyes and a kindness that seemed genuine. When she came by, I told her the letter was for my niece, an old family matter, I said, and asked if she could drop it in the public mailbox instead of leaving it at the front desk. She hesitated, but I must have looked desperate enough because she finally nodded. I watched her slip the envelope into her tote bag, my pulse hammering in my temples. As she walked away, I felt a strange mixture of terror and exhilaration, as though I had committed a crime and reclaimed a piece of myself in the same instant. For days after that, I waited. Every knock on the door made me startle. Every passing nurse seemed suddenly more watchful. I half expected the letter to come back, confiscated, proof that my small rebellion had failed. But nothing happened. Life in the facility continued with its dull rhythm: breakfast, medication, television, lights out. Only I was different now. I had a secret, a fragile thread connecting me to the world beyond those walls. Each morning I touched the lining of my sweater where the receipt lay hidden, a talisman against despair. For the first time in months, I felt awake. About a week later, the atmosphere in the building shifted. The staff seemed tenser. Gregory no longer lingered at my door with his empty compliments. One of the nurses whispered to another when they passed my room, and they both avoided my gaze. Something had reached them. Maybe a phone call, maybe a question from someone outside. I knew better than to ask. I simply waited, practicing patience the way other people practice faith. That was when I began to understand that power is not always about movement. Sometimes it's about stillness, about letting others reveal their fear first. One afternoon, as I was sitting in the common room pretending to read, the receptionist came to fetch me. "You have a visitor," she said. My heart leapt. Could it be Leo? But when I stepped into the small office near the entrance, I saw a woman I didn't know. She introduced herself as a representative from a legal firm. "We've received an inquiry concerning your estate, Mrs. Hale," she said, laying a folder on the table. "We just need to confirm a few details." I watched her carefully, weighing every word. She asked if I had recently authorized any financial transfers. I told her no. She nodded, her expression tightening slightly, and thanked me for my time. It was a short meeting, but when she left, I noticed Gregory hovering nearby, his face pale. He avoided my eyes for the first time since I'd arrived. That small avoidance was worth more than any confession. That night, the nurse on duty brought me tea and lingered by my bed longer than usual. She seemed nervous. "Mrs. Hale," she said, "I don't know what's going on, but there have been a lot of calls today about you." I asked if she knew from whom. She shook her head. "They don't tell us much, but whatever you did, it's getting attention." She smiled faintly, as if unsure whether to congratulate or warn me. After she left, I lay in the dark and felt a deep, trembling calm settle over me. It wasn't triumph exactly. It was the quiet recognition that something irreversible had begun. In the days that followed, I started to remember parts of myself I had forgotten. I began writing again, small notes and thoughts, not to hide this time, but to reclaim my own language. I wrote about the sea I hoped to see again, about the way Leo's hair used to curl at the back of his neck, about the sound of my husband's laughter echoing down the hallway of our old house. When he paused, waiting for me to protest or apologize, I said only, "I didn't accuse anyone. I just told the truth." There was a silence on the line, and then he muttered something about lawyers overreacting before hanging up. I sat there, the receiver still pressed to my ear, and felt the strangest sensation, a flicker of pity. For the first time, I saw my son not as a villain, but as a frightened man who had mistaken control for care, greed for responsibility. Understanding that didn't absolve him, but it freed me from the helplessness I had carried for so long. After that, I began preparing quietly for whatever would come next. I gathered my notes, the forged receipt, the letters I had managed to keep, and placed them in a neat stack inside my dresser drawer. I did not know if they would ever be needed, but arranging them gave me purpose. The walls of the facility still looked the same. The days still passed in sterile sameness, but the air had changed. I was no longer a passive figure in someone else's story. The center of my life, once displaced by fear and manipulation, had shifted back inside me. I could feel it, a steady pulse beneath the frailty of my skin. Something had begun to turn, slow and certain as the tide. The days that followed were heavy with a strange electricity, as if the air itself had begun to vibrate with the weight of unspoken consequences. Something had shifted outside those walls, And though the staff tried to maintain their usual calm rhythm, I could feel the tremor beneath their politeness. They spoke more quietly when I entered a room, their smiles too measured, their reassurances too rehearsed. Gregory, who used to glide through the halls like a benevolent overseer, now avoided eye contact altogether. Once, I saw him standing by the reception desk, whispering urgently into the phone, one hand gripping the edge of the counter as though holding himself steady. When he noticed me watching, he straightened, forced a smile, and said, "Everything's fine, Mrs. Hale. Just a busy day." His voice was tight, almost brittle. I nodded and returned to my room, closing the door slowly so he couldn't see the small, satisfied smile that had begun to form on my face, but satisfaction was fleeting. The silence that followed was deeper, heavier, like the calm before a storm whose direction I could not predict. A few days later, an unfamiliar man arrived at the facility. He was tall, expensively dressed, with a leather briefcase and an expression that combined sympathy and calculation in equal measure. He introduced himself as a family consultant sent to ensure my emotional well-being. The phrase alone made me wary. He asked if I was comfortable, if the staff were treating me properly, and then casually, whether I still wished to maintain contact with my son during what he called this sensitive legal misunderstanding. I looked at him for a long moment before answering. "I wish," I said slowly, "to maintain my own decisions." His smile faltered for a fraction of a second, then returned, smoother than before. When he left, I saw him speaking with Gregory in the hallway, their voices low but tense. Whatever storm was brewing, it had now reached their doorstep, and they didn't yet know how to weather it. A week later, Mark arrived unannounced. I was sitting in the common room, pretending to read, when I saw him through the glass doors. My heart lurched, part fear, part something deeper, a residue of maternal instinct that refused to die no matter how deeply it had been wounded. He looked older than I remembered, his face drawn, his once confident stride hesitant. Julia was not with him. When he entered, the staff greeted him with excessive politeness, as though eager to prove they were still on his side. He ignored them and came straight to me. "Mom," he said, his voice low but firm, "we need to talk." He didn't ask how I was. He didn't even sit down until I gestured toward the chair opposite mine. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The television in the corner played a commercial for pain medication, its bright, false cheer slicing through the silence. Finally, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You've caused a lot of trouble," he said quietly. "You don't understand how serious this is. The lawyers are asking questions, the bank is holding our accounts, and Julia is furious. They think I've stolen from you." I wanted to tell him that what he called trouble was merely the truth surfacing, that honesty is not a crime, but I remained silent. His face softened for a moment, and I saw the boy he once was, the boy who had scraped his knee and come running to me, seeking comfort. But then his expression hardened again. "Mom, you signed those papers. You gave me permission. Maybe you don't remember, but it's all there in writing." I looked at him steadily. "I remember what I signed," I said, "and what I didn't." Something flickered in his eyes then, fear or anger, I couldn't tell. He stood abruptly, pacing a few steps before turning back. "Do you think anyone's going to believe you? You're old, confused, living in a care facility. They'll say you misunderstood. They always do." His words, meant as a threat, filled me instead with a strange clarity. I realized that he still believed I was powerless, that my silence for all those months had convinced him I was already half gone. He had forgotten who I was before all this, the woman who had raised him, who had kept the books, balanced the accounts, negotiated with creditors, repaired the roof with her own hands. He thought he had erased me, but he had only made me invisible long enough to become dangerous. He left soon after, slamming the door behind him, and for a while I sat there, trembling, not from fear, but from the sheer intensity of having seen him clearly for the first time. The mask of filial concern had fallen away, and what remained was not evil exactly, but something smaller and more pitiful, a man shaped by entitlement and fear, desperate to maintain control of the narrative. I almost pitied him, almost, but pity is a luxury one cannot afford when reclaiming oneself. That evening, I wrote another letter to Mr. Patterson, describing the encounter, the threats, the fear in my son's eyes. I did not send it immediately. I read it over and over, each time refining the language, sharpening it, turning it into something precise and undeniable. Writing became my form of prayer, each word a declaration that I was still here, still capable of naming what had been done to me. Then came the retaliation, subtle at first. My access to the phone was suddenly restricted due to maintenance. My requests for fresh clothes from storage went unanswered. A nurse who had always been kind to me was reassigned to another wing. Meals arrived late, colder than usual. It was not cruelty, not directly, but a quiet campaign of inconvenience, a reminder that defiance had its costs. I endured it with deliberate calm, refusing to show the frustration they wanted to provoke. They mistook my composure for surrender, not realizing that patience was my weapon now. In the evenings, I watched the sunset through the narrow window, the sky bleeding orange into gray, and thought of Leo. I wondered what he knew, whether his father had told him I was ill or forgetful or simply gone. The thought of his voice, the certainty in his warning, kept me steady. Don't trust them. I repeated those words silently each night before sleep, a litany against despair. One morning, a letter arrived addressed to me in handwriting I didn't recognize. It was from Mr. Patterson's assistant. He wrote that the inquiry had uncovered irregularities in several financial documents, that further investigation was underway, and that I should expect a representative to contact me soon for an official statement. I read the letter 3 times, my hands trembling so badly I had to lay it flat on the table. Relief and dread intertwined inside me like vines. The truth was emerging, but I knew that exposure would provoke desperation. People who sense their power slipping often lash out before it is gone completely. I braced myself for the backlash. It came that evening. Gregory knocked on my door just after dinner, his smile brittle. "May I come in?" he asked, though he was already stepping across the threshold. He sat down uninvited and folded his hands on his knee. "Mrs. Hale," he began, "we've been reviewing your care plan, and due to recent developments, it's been decided that we'll be relocating you to our sister facility for specialized observation." I stared at him. "Observation," I repeated. "Am I ill?" He hesitated, then said, "It's just precautionary, given the stress you've been under." I realized then that this was an attempt to remove me, to silence me before the inquiry could proceed. I smiled faintly, surprising him. "I'll need to see that order in writing," I said. His face tightened. "That won't be necessary right now. The transfer can happen informally." I leaned forward, meeting his gaze directly for the first time in months. "Then it won't happen at all." My voice was calm, almost gentle, but the words landed between us like stones. He left soon after, muttering something about protocol. The next day, 2 men in suits arrived, claiming to be from a regulatory agency. They asked a few perfunctory questions and left quickly, but I saw one of them glance toward the administrator's office with an expression that told me they already suspected more than they could say. The tension in the facility thickened. Staff members moved with nervous energy. Conversation stopped abruptly when I entered a room. I sensed that whatever control they had maintained was slipping. One evening, long after lights out, I was awakened by a soft knock on my door. It was Nora, the volunteer who had mailed my first letter. She looked frightened. "They're planning to move you tonight," she whispered. "An unregistered transfer. I heard Gregory talking on the phone." My mind raced. Where would they take me? She shook her head. "I don't know, but it's not official. You'll have to call someone." I reached for the letter from Patterson's office and handed it to her. "Take this to them," I said. "Tell them I'm being moved without consent." She hesitated, then nodded and slipped away. I sat awake until dawn, my packed bag at my feet, heart pounding with a mixture of fear and defiance. The transfer never happened. By morning, Gregory was gone. The staff said he had resigned for personal reasons. I knew better. The inquiry intensified after that. Officials came, papers were collected, and whispers followed me down every corridor. The facility's tone toward me changed again, from subtle hostility to cautious respect. I was no longer an old woman to be managed, but a witness to be placated. When the lawyer finally arrived to take my formal statement, I spoke slowly, carefully, leaving nothing out. I described the papers, the forged signature, the withdrawals, even the conversation with my son. The lawyer listened in silence, taking notes. When I finished, he closed his folder and said quietly, "Mrs. Hale, you've done something remarkable. Most people in your position would have given up." I smiled faintly. "Most people in my position were taught not to make a fuss," I said. "I was too, but silence is a kind of death, and I've already buried enough of myself." When he left, I sat by the window watching the late autumn light settle over the courtyard. The trees were bare now, their branches black against the pale sky. For the first time in years, I felt the weight of fear lift, replaced by something steadier, resolve, perhaps, or simple peace. I did not yet know what the outcome would be, whether justice, that rare and awkward creature, would find its way through the tangle of lies and bureaucracy. But I knew this much. I was no longer afraid of being invisible. They had tried to make me small, compliant, erased, and instead they had created a woman who knew exactly how much power still lived in her silence, in her persistence, in her refusal to disappear. I would wait, as I had always waited, but this time not in submission. This time, I was waiting for the truth to finish its slow, inevitable work. It happened in the stillness of winter, when the light through the facility windows had turned the color of paper ash, and the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and oranges. Weeks had passed since Gregory's disappearance, and the staff now spoke to me with an uneasy politeness that bordered on fear. I was no longer the frail woman whose mail could be opened without consequence, or whose signature could be mimicked into compliance. I had become something less convenient, a living complication, a witness with a pulse. The investigation had grown beyond my imagination. Letters from lawyers, requests from the bank, even a visit from a government agent who took photographs of documents and asked quiet, pointed questions. I answered each one with the same calm precision that had once terrified my husband's accountants when I balanced our household ledgers by hand. I could feel the circle closing, not around me, but around those who had believed me harmless. The culmination came on a day so ordinary that it could have passed unnoticed. I was having tea in the common room when the administrator, new, young, nervous, came to tell me that my son had arrived. He was waiting in one of the private consultation rooms, she said, and asked to speak to me alone. I took my time finishing the tea, setting the cup down gently, letting the seconds stretch. The tremor that had lived in my hands for months was gone. I smoothed my skirt, fixed my collar, and walked down the corridor with slow, deliberate steps. Each sound, the squeak of my shoes on the linoleum, the low hum of the heating vents, felt amplified, part of a ceremony I had waited my entire life to conduct. Mark was standing by the window when I entered. He turned quickly, his face drawn, his eyes shadowed by exhaustion and something more brittle, something like panic. There was no trace of the confident man who had once decided, with bureaucratic ease, to rewrite his mother's life. He looked older, smaller, reduced by the gravity of consequences. He could no longer defer. "Mom," he said, and the word cracked in his mouth like a dry twig. I sat down, folded my hands, and waited. He remained standing, pacing the edge of the rug, running his fingers through his hair, the way he used to when he was a boy, trying to hide a bad grade. "They're freezing my accounts," he said. "Do you understand what that means?" His voice, "You didn't know what you were signing half the time. Julia and I, we thought it would be better if we took care of things before something happened." His words came faster now, as though the velocity could make them true. "You should have trusted me. All this, these accusations, they're destroying us. Leo's been asking questions. Julia's threatening to leave. You've turned everything upside down." Something inside me hardened then, not in anger, but in understanding. The world had always excused men like him, men who mistook control for love and called it duty when they erased others. I stood up slowly, feeling the stiffness in my knees, the weight of my years grounding me. "I trusted you, Mark," I said quietly. "That was my mistake. I believed you wanted to care for me, but you wanted to own me. You wanted me to vanish without noise, without paperwork, without resistance. And now that I've spoken, you call it destruction. I call it correction." He turned away, pressing his palms against the window glass, his reflection fractured by the cold light. "You don't understand," he whispered. "I did everything for you." The absurdity of it, his insistence that theft could be framed as devotion, might have made me laugh once, but laughter had long since been replaced by clarity. I walked toward him and placed a single envelope on the table between us. It was the copy of my official statement, the one filed by the legal investigators. My name was written on every page in ink they had watched me apply myself. "This," I said, "is the last thing I will ever sign for you." He stared at the envelope as though it were a weapon. I saw his mouth open, then close again, words collapsing before they formed. For a moment, I thought he might cry, but instead he took a deep breath, straightened, and said, "You're going to ruin me." I looked at him, the son I had raised, the man who had once fit in the crook of my arm, and felt a quiet that was not mercy, but release. "No," I said. "You did that yourself. I'm just the one who stopped helping you hide it." The silence that followed was vast and clean, like a field after harvest. He turned without another word and left the room. I stood there for a while, listening to his footsteps fade down the corridor, then sank back into the chair. My hands were steady on my knees. I felt no triumph, no vindication, only the slow exhale of years of submission leaving my lungs. It was as if the air itself had changed texture, denser, truer. Later that afternoon, the young administrator came to inform me that the investigation had concluded. My legal independence was restored, my accounts unfrozen, my residence at the facility now voluntary. I thanked her politely, noting the tremor in her voice, the nervous smile of someone who had realized too late which side of the story she'd been standing on. That evening, I began to pack the few belongings that were truly mine. A framed photograph of Leo, a wool sweater, a small notebook filled with my secret writings, and the receipt that had started it all. I placed them carefully into a single suitcase, folded the blanket from my bed, and sat waiting for morning. When dawn came, I signed my discharge papers with deliberate slowness, each letter of my name drawn with precision. The nurse who witnessed it looked at me with something like respect. Outside, the cold air stung my face, and for the first time in months, the world felt real again. I could hear the crunch of frost underfoot, smell the distant promise of the sea. A car was waiting, sent by Mr. Patterson's office, to take me to the small apartment they had arranged. As I climbed into the back seat, I glanced once more at the building behind me, its pale walls, its shuttered windows, its faint aura of institutional mercy, and felt nothing but distance. That place had been a tomb built out of kindness. I was leaving it alive. The drive was long, quiet. The city rolled past in muted colors, gray streets, shuttered shops, the faint blur of faces behind fogged bus windows. I watched them without attachment, each scene another reminder of how small and enormous freedom can feel when you have been deprived of it. When we reached the seaside town where I was to live, the air changed, salt and clean and biting. The lawyer's assistant carried my suitcase up the narrow stairs to a modest flat overlooking the water. "If you need anything, just call," she said, placing the key in my hand. I thanked her, waited for her footsteps to fade, and then stood alone in the quiet. For a long time, I didn't move. The room was bare, but sunlight spilled across the floor in a wide golden band. I could hear the distant cry of gulls, the rhythmic pull of the tide. I walked to the window and opened it, letting the cold wind rush in, filling my lungs. My reflection in the glass startled me. A thin, lined face, yes, but alive, awake, undeniably present. I touched the window pane, tracing the outline of my own eyes. I had imagined this moment so many times, the restoration, the victory, but standing there, I understood that what I felt was not triumph, but balance. Justice had not restored what was taken. It had simply stopped the theft. The real reclamation was quieter, deeper, something that existed only within me. That evening, as the light faded into the sea, I sat at the small table and wrote a final letter to Leo. I told him that truth is not loud, that sometimes it lives in the smallest acts of persistence, in the refusal to accept what others name as destiny. I told him that his words had saved me, that his warning had planted the seed of everything that followed. "Don't trust them," he had said, and I hadn't at last. When I sealed the envelope and wrote his name on it, my hands did not tremble. I set it on the table beside the window and watched the horizon turn from gold to gray to blue-black. The sea moved endlessly, patient and exacting, wearing down everything false. I thought then of how, in its rhythm, there was no triumph and no defeat, only continuation. That was enough. The sea has a sound that never ends, a breath that moves even when the world feels still. In the months since I left the facility, I have learned to live by that rhythm. Morning begins with the slow opening of curtains and the pale spill of light across the floorboards. I make tea. I read the newspaper. I walk to the edge of the shore with a cane I barely need, and I watch the horizon erase the boundaries between water and sky. There are moments when it feels as though I am dissolving into that vastness, becoming part of something larger than the noise of betrayal and restitution. People often speak of freedom as an event, a burst of light, a doorway flung open, but I have found it to be quieter than that. Freedom for me is the sound of the kettle whistling in the morning, the right to decide when to sleep, the small pleasure of unlocking my own front door. These are the privileges that once seemed too trivial to notice and now feel like prayers made solid. I have heard, through careful channels, that the inquiry concluded with quiet finality. The accounts were restored, the documents voided, the facility reprimanded, and my son's reputation reduced to polite whispers. There were no headlines, no dramatic trials, no cinematic closure. The world rarely gives women like me that kind of spectacle. What it gives instead is the long, deliberate restoration of agency, the slow unfurling of dignity that had been folded away. Mark sent one letter after the settlement, a thin envelope, half apology and half justification. I read it once, folded it carefully, and placed it in the drawer where I keep old photographs and other relics of things that cannot be repaired. I do not hate him. Hatred is a tether, and I have spent too many years learning how to unbind myself. What remains between us is distance, which is not punishment but safety. Perhaps one day he will understand that mercy is not forgiveness. It is the refusal to continue the cycle. Leo visits when he can. He is taller now, his voice deeper, but when he smiles, I still see the boy who whispered truth into the hollow of my fear. On the first visit, he brought a small seashell, smooth and white, and said he remembered that I used to collect them. We walked along the sand in silence, and then, very softly, he asked, "Did it hurt a lot?" I told him yes, but not in the way he might think. Pain, I said, is not only what others inflict on you, it is also what you inflict on yourself by pretending not to see. I had done that for years, looked away from small cruelties, excused disrespect, renamed neglect as love. The real injury was not what they took from me, but how willingly I had given it, believing obedience was the same as peace. He nodded, eyes down, and after a while he slipped his hand into mine, as he had when he was a child. We stood that way for a long time, facing the sea, and I thought that perhaps the truest inheritance I could offer him was not money or property, but the memory of a woman who refused to vanish quietly. At night I write, not letters or complaints anymore, but reflections, pages of memory arranged without bitterness. I write about the smell of my old kitchen, the laughter of my husband, the way my mother used to hum when she ironed, and how love, despite everything, continues to shape even those who misuse it. I write because memory is a kind of ownership, and I want to own my life again, every flawed and shining part of it. Sometimes I leave the window open as I write, and the sound of the sea folds into the words, as if time itself were reminding me that nothing truly ends, it only transforms. There are mornings when the world feels lighter, and I almost forget the sharpness of what was done. Other days, the past returns like a shadow crossing the sunlight, sudden and heavy. On those days, I let it come. I pour another cup of tea. I sit by the window, and I let memory have its way. Healing, I have learned, is not the absence of pain, but the ability to live beside it without fear. The wound becomes part of the landscape, visible, enduring, but no longer defining. I tell myself that this is what survival truly means, not to emerge unscarred, but to inhabit the scars with grace. Sometimes, when I walk through the small market in town, people greet me politely without knowing who I am. To them, I am just another elderly woman with kind eyes and a quiet air. They cannot see the long story folded inside me, the years of silence, the fire of reclamation, and I prefer it that way. Let the world think I am ordinary. There is a freedom in invisibility when it is chosen. I smile, I buy my fruit, I breathe the salt air, and I carry on. Before I go to bed, I keep one ritual. I light a small candle on the windowsill and whisper a single line to no one and to everyone. May the truth always find its way to the ones who are told to stay silent. The flame trembles, catches the reflection of the sea beyond, and steadies itself. That small flickering light is my conversation with all the women who have sat in rooms where their voices were treated as inconvenience. It is a signal, a promise, that even when the world insists on shrinking us, we can still choose the vastness of our own mind. When I lie down and close my eyes, I no longer dream of the house I lost or the rooms I was locked inside. I dream of open doors, of wind rushing through them, of a horizon that never ends. In the morning, I will wake again to the sound of the tide, to the rhythm that asks for nothing and forgives everything. I will walk to the shore, pick up a new shell, and add it to the line of them on my windowsill. Each one carries a trace of the sea's persistence, each one shaped by the same patient motion that remade me. The past still exists, but it no longer owns me. I live in the quiet aftermath of my own storm, and that quiet, steady life is my victory.